The lights inside the Georgetown auditorium glowed like a stage prepared for a national conversation, and everyone knew exactly who the established figures and unexpected challengers were supposed to be. The event, Voices Shaping America's Future, was meant to be a calm policy forum, but the moment American actor Jonathan Roumie walked through the doors, cameras pivoted, whispers ignited, and the crowd's energy shifted like a storm front rolling in. He carried himself with a quiet intensity, a gravitas familiar to those who knew his work. Across the room, former President Joe Biden stood surrounded by staffers, the practiced smile never leaving his face. He noticed the actor instantly. His expression tightened just enough for the cameras to miss it, just enough for Jonathan Roumie to catch it. The former president had spent decades dominating rooms like this. Now, a respected actor, influential in a different sphere, was pulling attention away from him. And Jonathan Roumie took his seat on the panel, placing a small, worn notebook on the table. He didn't need it, but he brought it to send one message. He was prepared to speak from conviction. The moderator opened the discussion with routine questions: economic policy, national unity, the role of leadership. Former President Biden answered like someone reading from a script he'd memorized decades ago. The actor, Jonathan Roumie, responded with a compelling, human clarity, speaking to cultural shifts, shared values, in a tone that made even those who disagreed lean forward to hear more. Then it happened. The moderator turned to former President Biden. Mr. President, you've said recently that some public figures, particularly those leveraging their platforms outside of traditional politics, are a threat to democratic stability and national discourse. Who exactly did you mean? Former President Biden's eyes flashed, and he didn't hesitate. Well, he began, when you have individuals influential and frankly disruptive, who use their platforms to spread divisive narratives without understanding the real-world consequences, yes, that becomes a threat. And Mr. Roumie here, he gestured openly, is a perfect example. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The cameras swiveled. The stage transformed from a panel to a battleground. Jonathan Roumie didn't blink. He looked the former president dead in the eye, steady, almost reflective. He could feel the heat of the audience's anticipation pressing in on him, could sense the clips already being cut for social media. Former President Biden continued, his voice sharpening. He spreads misinformation, undermines trust in our institutions, and represents the type of public figure that endangers everything we've worked decades to build. The moderator stiffened, unsure how to redirect. Jonathan Roumie slowly adjusted his microphone. His jaw set, not in anger, but in resolve. He knew former President Biden wasn't just attacking him. He was attacking independent voices, a different perspective, and everyone who refused to fall in line with established political narratives. The crowd waited. Jonathan Roumie inhaled, then said in a calm, cutting voice, Mr. President, if I'm a threat, it's only because people like you have spent years hiding things you never wanted the American public to see. The room froze. Half the panelists shifted uncomfortably. The other half leaned forward, unable to look away. Former President Biden's face tightened. Not with anger this time, but with recognition. He knew exactly what Jonathan Roumie was referring to, and he knew it was only the beginning. The actor wasn't there to survive former President Biden. He was there to expose him. The room didn't quiet down. It tightened. The energy inside the Georgetown forum shifted the second former President Biden leaned toward his microphone, chin raised, voice sharpened like a blade polished for decades. Jonathan Roumie, he said slowly, each syllable dripping with the political theater, isn't just reckless, he's dangerous. A threat to national unity. Gasps, murmurs, phones lifting. The former president knew exactly what he was doing, dropping a line heavy enough to dominate headlines before breakfast. A seasoned veteran of Washington warfare, he delivered it with the confidence of someone who'd survived every campaign, every challenge, every political storm. His eyes never left the actor's face, but Jonathan Roumie didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift in his seat. He simply let the words hang there like smoke waiting for a gust of wind. Across the stage, several panelists stared at former President Biden with a mixture of admiration and nervousness. They could practically feel the aftershocks of the accusation rolling across the audience. The former president smiled faintly, sensing momentum, sensing victory. He added, "We've seen voices like his before. Loud, divisive, careless with facts, and we all know where that leads." The moderator swallowed hard. Jonathan Roumie finally lifted his chin, not fast, not defensive, controlled, measured. The room locked onto him like he carried a profound truth. "Mr. President," Jonathan Roumie said, his voice clear enough to slice through the tension, "if speaking the truth makes me a threat, I wonder what that makes you." Former President Biden froze. A 2-second delay, barely noticeable, but enough for the audience to feel it. Jonathan Roumie continued, still calm, still steady. "You've spent years telling Americans that transparency matters, that accountability matters. Yet every time someone asks questions about your family's business dealings, your past policy decisions, your changing stances, you dismiss them as attacks or misinformation. Phones shot up everywhere. Someone whispered, 'Oh God, he's going there.'" Former President Biden's jaw tightened. Jonathan Roumie wasn't finished. "I didn't come here to insult you," the actor said. "I came here because people from all walks of life are tired of being told that questioning powerful people, especially powerful men, is somehow a danger to democracy." A few members of the audience clapped before catching themselves. Jonathan Roumie leaned slightly forward. "You built a career preaching that Americans should engage, but apparently that only applies when we agree with you." A ripple rolled through the entire venue. Former President Biden opened his mouth to respond, but Jonathan Roumie pressed on, his voice steady, unshaken. "And since you brought up threats, maybe the real threat is when those in power hide things from the American people. Maybe the real threat is pretending accountability is only for others." The moderator glanced at former President Biden, then at Jonathan Roumie, then back at the former president, who now sat perfectly still, lips pressed together, calculating, wounded but refusing to show it. Jonathan Roumie sat back in his chair, eyes steady. The momentum had flipped completely. The crowd knew it. Former President Biden felt it. The actor owned it. And the atmosphere of the hall would never return to its previous state. The studio lights glared hotter than usual, as if they sensed the tension rising before anyone spoke it aloud. American actor Jonathan Roumie sat poised in his chair, chin lifted, fingers locked calmly on the table before him. Across from him, former President Joe Biden adjusted his blazer with the ease of someone who believed he owned every room he entered. The moderator barely finished introducing the segment when the former president leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "He is a threat," former President Biden said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that sliced straight through the audience chatter. "Not because he's strong, not because he's capable, but because he spreads misinformation and destabilizes trust in our institutions." A few people in the audience gasped. Cameras zoomed in. Social media comment bubbles were already popping off screen. Jonathan Roumie didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by people far more powerful. Former President Biden wasn't finished. "Public figures like him," he added, "don't understand the consequences of their reckless rhetoric. They divide more than they build." Jonathan Roumie felt the pressure settle on the stage, not on his shoulders, but on former President Biden's words hanging in the air like smoke. The former president expected him to shrink, to defend himself timidly, to react emotionally. Instead, Jonathan Roumie inhaled slowly and let silence do the work. Silence always terrified those hiding something. Then he looked directly into the camera. "Mr. President," Jonathan Roumie said calmly, "if speaking the truth makes me a threat, then maybe the problem isn't me." A subtle wave rippled through the crowd. Jonathan Roumie continued, his tone measured and devastatingly precise. "You accuse me of dividing people, but there's something you're avoiding, something Americans remember, even if you hope they've forgotten." Former President Biden stiffened for the first time. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just low enough to force everyone to listen. "For years, you preached transparency while hiding the one thing every American had the right to know. The true nature of certain family business dealings, the decisions made behind closed doors that shaped economic policy, and the shifting narratives around public trust." The room went still. Even the moderator blinked at him, unsure if he should intervene. Jonathan Roumie didn't stop. "You want to call me a threat?" he said. "Fine, but the only reason you see me that way is because I'm not afraid to say what others tiptoe around. Your biggest legacy isn't leadership, it's evasion." A murmur swept the audience like a sudden gust of wind. Cameras swung wildly to capture former President Biden's expression. Jaw tight, lips pressed together, eyes burning. Jonathan Roumie finished with a line he knew would detonate online. "And unlike you, I don't hide my true intentions, obscure my public record, or deflect accountability from the American people." The audience erupted, some cheering, some stunned, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Former President Biden blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the precision of the hit. He expected a defensive answer, not a direct strike at the weakest parts of his political history. The moderator tried to regain control. "Gentlemen, let's..." But the moment was already gone. The clip was destined to go viral within minutes. Jonathan Roumie sat back, calm as ever, while former President Biden tried to collect himself. For the first time in years, someone had directly challenged former President Joe Biden, an actor no less, and done it in front of millions. The lights inside the CNN debate hall dimmed slightly as the commercial break ended. Former President Joe Biden straightened his blazer, forcing a calm expression, but the tension clinging to his eyes was impossible to hide. He had spent the last several minutes whispering instructions to his aide, his jaw tight, his posture stiff. American actor Jonathan Roumie, standing alone at his podium across the stage, didn't flinch. He kept his gaze forward, fingers resting lightly on his modest notebook, though he hadn't needed to look at it once. The moderator's voice returned. "Welcome back." Before the break, former President Biden claimed that Jonathan Roumie poses a national threat. "Mr. Roumie, you were not allowed to finish responding. You now have the floor." A soft ripple moved through the audience. Anticipation, curiosity, maybe a little dread. Jonathan Roumie inhaled once, lifted his chin, and faced the former president directly. "Mr. President," he began, his voice steady but sharp, "you've spent decades accusing everyone who challenges you of being a threat to your legacy, to your narrative, to your power. But being questioned is not persecution." Former President Biden forced a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. Jonathan Roumie continued, stepping out from behind his podium, bold, deliberate. "You said I'm dangerous because I'm outspoken and refuse to bend to Washington's elite. But the truth is simpler. I am a threat because I don't fear you." Gasps erupted through the audience. Cameras zoomed in. Former President Biden blinked rapidly, his expression cracking for the first time. Jonathan Roumie held up a stack of printed reports and articles, thick, tabbed, impossible to ignore. "You called me a threat, but these," he shook the stack lightly, "are the real threats. Public statements you contradicted, policy failures your administration downplayed, investigative reports your team hoped the public would never fully scrutinize." Former President Biden leaned toward his microphone. "Those documents are misinterpreted." Jonathan Roumie raised a hand. "No, they're verified quotes, recorded dates, official directives, published warnings, and they all have one thing in common." He paused, letting the room breathe the silence. "Your name is on every one of them." The audience murmured louder, sharper, restless. Jonathan Roumie walked back to his podium, his steady steps striking the floor with the confidence of someone who knew he had just detonated a profound truth. "You spent years shaping a story where you're the victim of misinformation, but the truth was never lost. It was hidden by you. And now the American people deserve to hear what you worked so hard to keep quiet." Former President Biden's face drained of color. His aide scrambled behind the curtain. The moderator looked stunned, unsure whether to intervene or sit back and witness history unfold. Jonathan Roumie finished with a clean, devastating line. "You called me a threat, but tonight, Mr. President, the only thing threatened is your version of the truth." The audience erupted, cheers from some, stunned silence from others. Even those who disliked Jonathan Roumie couldn't deny what they just felt. A seismic shift on live television. The studio lights dimmed just slightly, enough for the cameras to tighten their frame on Jonathan Roumie as he stepped forward, his purposeful steps striking the stage like a countdown to impact. Former President Joe Biden stood across from him, arms crossed, chin raised, wearing that familiar expression, the practiced blend of superiority and irritation he'd perfected over decades of political battle. But tonight, something was different. The former president wasn't controlling the moment. He was surviving it. "You call me a threat to democracy," Jonathan Roumie said, his voice steady, the room hanging on to every syllable. "But the only thing I threaten is the comfort of people who never expected someone like me, an actor, to speak up." Former President Biden let out a cold laugh. "Please, you're a mouthpiece, an actor reading talking points written for you." That was the moment Jonathan Roumie had been waiting for. He lifted a thin folder from the podium and held it up for the cameras. "Then explain this," he said, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "Because these aren't talking points. These are your words, Mr. President." A murmur erupted across the audience. Former President Biden stiffened. Jonathan Roumie opened the folder slowly, deliberately, letting the tension tighten like wire. For years, you dismissed questions about your family's finances. You blamed political opponents. You said there was no influence peddling. He tapped the folder. But the public records and statements connected to your name suggest otherwise. Former President Biden's smile evaporated. Jonathan Roumie continued, his voice gaining force. The American people were told everything was handled, everything was explained, everything was transparent. He closed the folder with a snap, but nothing was transparent. You obscured it, and you obscured it because you knew exactly what you were doing. Gasps scattered through the studio. The moderator tried to step in, but Jonathan Roumie didn't slow. You call me dangerous. I'm an actor, a public figure. I've never destroyed public records. I've never misled the American people about my intentions. I've never threatened those who seek the truth, and I've never, ever put public trust at risk to protect myself. Former President Biden's jaw clenched so hard the cameras caught it. Jonathan Roumie stepped even closer, his voice lower now, more lethal. You built a political career on carefully curated narratives, on closed doors, on hiding what the country had the right to know, and the minute someone unexpected, a public figure like me who was unafraid, stands up, suddenly we're the threat. The audience exploded, cheers, applause, shouts echoing through the room. Even some who came in skeptical now saw it clearly. Former President Biden was on his heels, and Jonathan Roumie had seized the narrative. Former President Biden leaned into his mic, forcing confidence into a voice that wasn't steady. This is nonsense. No, Jonathan Roumie said, cutting him off cleanly. This is the truth you never expected to face from someone you couldn't dismiss. The room shook again with applause. Former President Biden looked away, blinking rapidly as if searching for an escape line. Jonathan Roumie ended the moment with a single devastating sentence. You say I'm a threat, Mr. President. Maybe I am, to the world you spent years trying to protect. And the studio erupted. The studio felt different now, tense, electric, as if the lights themselves sensed the shift in power. Former President Joe Biden had entered the debate with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades owning every room he walked into. But for the first time tonight, there was a flicker behind his eyes. Something uncertain, something he hadn't felt in years. Jonathan Roumie had pushed him into unfamiliar territory. The former president tried to regain ground, stepping closer to the podium. You can throw talking points all night, he said, voice sharp. But the truth is simple. People like you, a public figure who is inexperienced in governance, easily manipulated by partisan narratives, are the reason misinformation thrives. You are a threat because you don't understand how dangerous your words can be. The word threat echoed through the studio like a slap. Jonathan Roumie didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lifted his chin, letting the silence thicken. Dangerous, he repeated. No, Mr. President. What's dangerous is pretending the American people forgot what you did. A gasp rippled across the audience. Jonathan Roumie stepped forward, his posture steady, his tone slicing through the tension like ice. You say I'm manipulated, but my platform is public. My intentions are transparent, and my influence is earned. Yours? He paused long enough for every camera in the room to zoom in. Yours includes public gaffes, shifting policy stances, questions about family business dealings, and a political machine built on legacy and loyalty. You want to talk about danger? Start there. Former President Biden's jaw froze. He gripped the podium, knuckles whitening. Jonathan Roumie continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. You call me inexperienced, but maybe it's the time someone without your decades-long list of political complexities spoke up. Someone who hasn't spent his life navigating the shadows of Washington. The audience erupted. Cheers, shouts, an energy shift so powerful former President Biden blinked in surprise. Jonathan Roumie didn't let up. You say I'm a threat? Good, because the truth should threaten people who spent their careers controlling it. Former President Biden's expression shifted. Annoyance, disbelief, something dangerously close to panic. He hadn't expected this. He wasn't used to being challenged by a prominent actor, let alone someone who refused to bow. Jonathan Roumie delivered the final blow with quiet strength. You obfuscated the truth for years. I just brought it to light. The room exploded. Former President Biden stared at him like he was seeing him for the first time. Not just an actor, not a political rookie, but an opponent he was rapidly losing control over. And Jonathan Roumie stood there, composed, unwavering, fully aware. The turning point had arrived, and former President Joe Biden was no longer the most powerful voice in the room. Former President Joe Biden had been in countless battles, Senate hearings, presidential debates, global negotiations, yet nothing about American actor Jonathan Roumie's presence felt predictable. And on that stage, under the bright lights, the former president finally sensed something he hadn't felt in years. He had underestimated his challenger. The moderator turned toward former President Biden. Mr. President, would you like to respond to Mr. Roumie's claim that you obscured information from the public? The former president adjusted his blazer, forcing a confident smile. Jonathan is an actor. He's passionate, but passion isn't evidence. I've spent my life serving this country, and I won't be lectured on transparency by someone who operates outside the political arena. Jonathan Roumie didn't move, didn't blink. He simply lifted a folder, thick, tabbed, organized. I didn't bring passion tonight, Jonathan Roumie said. I brought verified reports. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Former President Biden's smile faded. Jonathan Roumie opened the folder, pulling out a single sheet. This is an excerpt from a public accounting report dated 2018, detailing concerns over certain foreign business dealings linked to your family and the subsequent efforts to deflect media scrutiny. The public largely only saw the official dismissals. The audience gasped. Former President Biden stiffened. Jonathan Roumie continued, his tone sharp but controlled. You call me inexperienced, Mr. President, but your experience seems to include obscuring problems instead of fully addressing them. Former President Biden leaned forward, voice tight. That report is taken out of context. Jonathan Roumie stepped closer, closing the gap between them. Then explain the context right now in front of millions. Silence. The moderator swallowed hard. Even the camera zoomed in as former President Biden's eyes darted, calculating, cornered. Jonathan Roumie delivered the blow softly, which somehow made it hit harder. You said I'm a threat. Maybe I am. Not to America, but to the way politics used to work. The line hit like a detonation. Cheers erupted. Phones lifted. The crowd leaned entirely toward Jonathan Roumie. Now former President Biden's posture faltered. Not fully defeated, but shaken in a way he hadn't shown publicly in decades. Jonathan Roumie held the stage with effortless authority, and the former president, for the first time that night, understood. This wasn't just an actor he thought he could dismiss. This was a voice millions were beginning to listen to. For the first time that night, former President Joe Biden felt something he hadn't expected to feel on a stage he believed he owned. The room pulling away from him. The crowd didn't lean toward him anymore. They leaned toward Jonathan Roumie, hungry for whatever the actor would articulate next. Even the camera seemed to shift in his direction, as if instinctively sensing who now carried the momentum. The former president tried to regain control. He straightened his blazer, lifted his chin, and adopted the commanding tone that once dominated an entire election cycle. Jonathan, he said, people like you have been manipulated by dangerous narratives. You're a product of misinformation and, frankly, a threat to the stability we've worked decades to build. It was meant to sound sharp, presidential. Instead, it sounded defensive. Jonathan Roumie didn't step back. He stepped forward, closing the space between them with the confidence of someone who had already dismantled every argument thrown his way. Mr. President, he replied evenly, if telling the truth is a threat to your stability, then maybe the problem isn't me or those who listen to me. Maybe the problem is what you've been hiding. A ripple ran through the audience. People shifted in their seats. Phones came up. Former President Biden stiffened. Jonathan Roumie continued, his voice steady, surgical. You accuse us of being misinformed, yet you're the one whose administration faced questions about transparency. You're the one who often blamed others when policies went wrong. And now you want to call me the threat? Former President Biden tried to interject, but Jonathan Roumie was already rolling, calm, relentless. You say I'm manipulated? No, I think for myself. I speak for myself. And unlike you, I don't need a political machine behind me to defend every misstep I've made. A low murmur swelled. Former President Biden's jaw tightened. Jonathan Roumie finished with the line that snapped the entire audience awake. You built a career on careful messaging and controlled narratives, and you're terrified of a public that wasn't around to be swayed by it. We don't owe you silence. We don't owe you unquestioning loyalty, and we definitely don't owe you fear. The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, camera flashes. Former President Biden blinked, caught off guard by the ferocity of the reaction. For the first time, he realized the truth. This wasn't his era anymore. This wasn't his room. And Jonathan Roumie, the actor, unfiltered, unbothered, had just stolen the stage he spent decades trying to control. Former President Joe Biden sat back in his chair, smoothing the sleeve of his blazer as if the fabric could steady the tremor of frustration building beneath his polished expression. The moderator turned to him, hoping he might recover the moment Jonathan Roumie had just shattered with his exposé. Cameras zoomed in. The former president cleared his throat, lifting his chin with that familiar tone of superiority. "Jonathan," he began, his voice steady but undeniably strained, "you're misrepresenting decades of public service. You've taken pieces of history out of context to score applause. That might work for an actor, but it's not how governing works." Some in the audience clapped, hesitant, scattered, more out of habit than conviction. Jonathan Roumie didn't even blink. "Mr. President," he replied calmly, "context is exactly what you avoid. That's why the truth keeps coming back to haunt you." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Former President Biden pressed on, trying to regain footing. "You can criticize my decisions, but I've spent my life fighting for democracy, for this country's stability, for global alliances." Jonathan Roumie stepped forward, and deflecting everything that contradicts that story. The studio snapped, silent again. Jonathan Roumie continued, his voice low, precise, each word landing like a controlled strike. "You say you defend democracy, but when Americans ask questions, your administration was slow to respond. When families asked for accountability, you spoke of complexities. When issues of transparency arose, you dismissed it as political maneuvering. And now you stand here telling me I'm the threat?" A shockwave hit the audience. Gasps, hands over mouths, sudden applause erupting from the back rows. Former President Biden stiffened, eyes narrowing. "That's enough," he said sharply. "You're spreading misinformation." "No," Jonathan Roumie said, cutting him cleanly. "I'm repeating your own public record. And the reason the crowd reacts this way isn't because I twist facts. It's because they remember." The applause grew louder, stronger this time. Jonathan Roumie leaned in just slightly, delivering the line that made the room erupt. "You didn't fear me because I'm wrong, Mr. President. You feared me because I'm finally saying out loud what millions already know." Former President Biden's face froze, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. And the crowd, they were no longer deciding who to believe. They had already chosen. The studio lights dimmed as the final segment began, but the tension in the room only sharpened. Former President Joe Biden sat stiffly, arms crossed, that familiar half-smile frozen on his face, the one he used whenever he felt a loss slipping through his fingers. American actor Jonathan Roumie, however, looked calm, almost collected, even after rounds of verbal warfare that had left the former president visibly shaken. The former president tried one last time to rewrite the narrative. "Jonathan," he began, voice tight, "your platform is built on attacking figures like me, established leaders, those who've spent decades fighting for democracy. You are a threat, not because you're powerful, but because you're reckless." The audience shifted uneasily. It was the same line the former president had used against many challengers for years. But Jonathan Roumie didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the microphone, his voice steady, piercing, unshakable. "Mr. President, the only thing I threaten is the comfortable silence that protected you for decades." Gasps rippled across the room. Jonathan Roumie continued, his tone rising with controlled force. "You say you fought for democracy, but you spent your career navigating complex political dealings. Questions about foreign policy outcomes, about domestic decisions that impacted everyday Americans. You accuse me of being reckless, but the recklessness was yours long before I ever stepped into this public conversation." Former President Biden's smile finally cracked. "And here's the difference between us," Jonathan Roumie added. "I don't hide behind power. I challenge it." The audience erupted, applause swelling, some rising to their feet as the former president shifted back in his chair, visibly rattled. Jonathan Roumie delivered the finishing blow. "You called me a threat. You're right, I am. Not to democracy, but to the political machine that protected you. And tonight the American people saw exactly why." Former President Biden's expression hardened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The moderator stepped in, stunned. "Well, I think that speaks for itself." The crowd cheered even louder. Jonathan Roumie turned, walking off the stage with the confidence of someone who hadn't just won a debate, but ended an era. And across the country, the message spread instantly. Jonathan Roumie, the actor, didn't just expose former President Biden. He redefined the conversation. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to see more content breaking down the big stories and cultural clashes, don't forget to smash that like button. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.